Understanding qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that shields government officials, particularly law enforcement officers, from being held personally liable for actions taken in the course of their duties, as long as those actions did not violate clearly established law. This principle was designed to protect officials from frivolous lawsuits while allowing them to perform their duties without fear of constant legal challenges. The origins of qualified immunity. The concept of qualified immunity originated in the 1967 U.S. Supreme Court case Pearson v. Ray. The court ruled that police officers could not be held liable for violating an individual's civil rights unless they were plainly incompetent or knowingly violated the law. This ruling sought to balance the protection of individual rights with the practicalities of law enforcement. How qualified immunity works. Qualified immunity applies when a government official is sued for misconduct. To overcome this immunity, the plaintiff must show that the official violated a clearly established constitutional right. This can be a challenging standard, as courts often require previous case law showing that similar actions had been ruled unconstitutional. Controversy over the doctrine. Qualified immunity is controversial because critics argue that it allows government officials, especially police officers, to act with little accountability. They claim that the doctrine often prevents victims of civil rights violations from seeking justice, as it makes it difficult to prove that the official's actions were clearly unlawful. Impact on police accountability. The most significant application of qualified immunity has been in cases involving police misconduct. Critics argue that it has made it harder to hold police officers accountable for excessive use of force, racial profiling, and other violations of civil rights. This has led to calls for reform, especially following high-profile cases of police violence. Legal and public push for reform. There has been growing public and legal pressure to reform or eliminate qualified immunity. Some advocates argue that the doctrine has created a culture of impunity within law enforcement. In response, there have been efforts in Congress and some state legislatures to limit or abolish qualified immunity, seeking to hold officers more accountable for their actions. Support for qualified immunity. Proponents of qualified immunity argue that it is necessary to protect government officials from being sued for actions that were taken in good faith. They contend that without this protection, public servants, particularly law enforcement officers, would be deterred from performing their duties for fear of personal liability, ultimately undermining public safety and effective governance. Legal precedents and judicial interpretation. The application of qualified immunity often hinges on judicial interpretation. Courts have varied in their rulings on what constitutes a clearly established law, making it difficult for plaintiffs to navigate the legal system. This inconsistency has contributed to the controversy, as decisions can appear to be based more on procedural technicalities than on justice for victims. Reform movements and legislative action. In recent years, there have been calls for Congress to pass federal legislation that would curb qualified immunity. Advocates for change believe that reform would make it easier for victims of police brutality and other civil rights violations to hold officials accountable. However, efforts at the federal level have faced significant opposition. The future of qualified immunity. As debates about police reform and civil rights continue, the future of qualified immunity remains uncertain. While some states have begun to pass laws limiting its application, comprehensive reform at the national level remains a contentious issue. The ongoing conversation highlights the tension between protecting public officials and ensuring accountability for civil rights violations.